Hello. You're listening to The Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. The lower orders of medieval society often appear in our sources doing apparently baffling things. A rebel leader in Kent in 1450, though gendered by one chronicler as a man, apparently described himself as the Queen of Faerie. He attracted followers who painted their faces black with charcoal and merrily plundered their lord's deer park. Across Europe, against the wishes of the authorities, ordinary people venerated their own saints. Some of these now seem rather hard to understand. For example, Nicholas of Aarhus, who died quietly in bed rather than being martyred, and whose miracles included resurrecting a dead cow. Or the false Olaf, a Prussian peasant who was burnt at the stake for impersonating the king of Denmark and Norway. Or Saint Gwynfor, who was a dog. In disputes with their lords, peasants sometimes presented legal arguments which seemed bizarre to the elite, and still have a propensity to puzzle historians today. Rebels at St. Albans in 1381 demanded to see charters they believed were being hidden from them. Charters which almost certainly never existed, but which the peasants claimed were 400 years old and written in azure and gold. Rebels in Denmark in 1441 met in assemblies and sent around a burned arrow, which they believed made their uprising official. One way to try to understand the confusing world of medieval peasants and other commoners has been to turn to anarchist thinkers, and especially anthropologists. The promise of anarchist perspectives, recognized by historians who are not themselves necessarily anarchists, is that we might understand the medieval public not as weird, but as self-organizing, perhaps doing things that make perfect sense from the perspective of people trying to get out from underneath the power of the elite. So it is that anarchists such as the late David Graeber or the stalwart of peasant studies James C. Scott are increasingly cited in medieval history. Joining me to talk about the anarchist turn in medieval history is Lars Kjær, Associate Professor in Medieval History at Northeastern University, London. Thanks for coming on, Lars.
Thank you so much, Richard. I love the story of Gwynfor, the dog.
It's good, isn't it?
It's wonderful. What I think is just particularly kind of gripping about it is this insistent and kind of like, good intended, you could say, attempt by the church authorities to get them to stop.
Mm.
We've got all these Dominicans showing up in the village being like, definitely a good dog, lovely dog, that's really impressive, doesn't have a soul, can't be a saint. and the clear evidence that they kind of, they nod, they say, yep, that's great, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And then they turn up, right, like 20 years later, and they're still worshipping this dog.
Yeah.
But it's a fantastic story. I remember telling it to my kids, right? And they are, the dog saves a baby and gets kind of like unjustly killed because they think it's killed the baby and so on. It's a fantastic story. And it travels. I ran into it in Wales on a hiking trip.
Okay.
We were waiting for a bus at a small village, waiting for a long time. We'd missed the bus. And there was a kind of like a plaque nearby at some old building, go and see this. And I don't remember what the local saint's name was, but clearly some forgotten early medieval saint. And then there was a description of the saint, and it turned out that they had locally kind of completely forgotten the actual saint. And instead, at some point, the Gwynfor story had been imported, and they now believed that saint was a dog.
Okay.
And was Gwynfor.
Yeah.
So someone from this village in Wales must have been to France, heard the Gwynfor story, and it somehow made its way there.
That's incredible.
And somehow, I don't know, the story is just so good that you can't keep a good dog down.
Yeah. That's the takeaway here. That's the
Something like
punchline.
that,
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I mean, I think actually the matter of Gwynfor, the idea of these sort of, well, I'm going to use the term peasants here a bit broadly, but the lower orders or the commoners, going away and venerating this dog, church authorities come and say, don't do that. Oh, okay, fine. And then, as you say, 20 years later, they're still doing it. And then it's even spreading, in fact. That does lead me to the question that I've been asking everybody on this podcast, which is, what does the Middle Ages mean to you? Is there some sort of medieval mentality or spirit Actually, when you tell a story like that, it does make me think about some sort of medieval spirit or mentality.
I think absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to kind of like claim that what like led me to the Middle Ages was some kind of like intellectual kind of like thing. It was like Tolkien and swords and stuff. But I guess what's kept me here, professionally speaking, or at least what I'd claim, is what my public transcript of why I'm a medievalist would be, is that it is about this possibility to govern. Right? It can't be governed properly.
It's a time when states are weak.
Yeah, it's weak states. Anyway. And I think that to me is fascinating. My background was in social anthropology before I moved over to history in the Middle Ages. And for me, there's something absolutely fascinating in having a kind of society that has all kinds of ideas of public. They have kings. They know what res publica is, and they have kind of like political kind of debates and stuff.
But they have political thoughts and philosophy,
all that stuff. But it happens in a society that is, in many fundamental ways, just very, very alien to what one grows up expecting in Denmark and the UK, right? These days. And that to me is absolutely kind of endlessly fascinating, how those things clash with each other.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. And that does set the tone for some of the things that we need to talk about today, which is superb. In the title for today's podcast, we've talked about the anarchist turn. And I suppose that I want to get ahead of a potential head scratcher that listeners might be having. What would you say to someone who might protest that anarchism is an anachronism because nobody in the Middle Ages called themselves an anarchist, therefore you can't talk about anarchism in the Middle Ages. It's you can't do this, right? Sometimes you come across this type of argument. This is real old school kind of stuff, but back when there was a theory turn in the kind of, actually in medieval studies, mostly in the early 90s, but there's stuff going on from the 70s and 80s onwards. People would say like, oh, you can't do Freudian psychoanalysis on Arthurian tales because Freud wasn't born then. Never an argument that seemed terribly convincing to me, but that was the kind of question people asked. What would we say to a naysayer who wanted to do the same thing for anarchism?
I'll first give you the kind of, what I'd actually do, and then I'll tell you about the kind of like more substantial thing. I just kind of like nod and pretend they hadn't spoken because I find all debates about terminology. Not all of them, but 90% of the debates about what we call the thing, I just find them kind of, they never go anywhere. They're never the most interesting. But there's a more substantial answer to it. I would say that anarchism, as a kind of starting point, or anarchist affiliated thought, as a starting point, is an alternate path towards understanding the alterity of the Middle Ages. And when I say an alternative path, the one that I'm kind of thinking of, its kind of sibling, is the social anthropological turn. Social anthropological turn, this kind of like drawing of inspiration from studies of stateless societies, often what we used to call small-scale societies, non-literate societies, say kind of like around the Pacific, New Guinea, and so forth. And this has been a massively influential turn, especially recently within Scandinavian medieval historiography.
We can put some dates on that, or rough time periods.
I would say that since 2000, it's been really kind of like powerful in Scandinavia, with work such as by Lars Kjær, by Kim Esmark and Jakob Orning, and so forth. And what's good about it is that it obviously uses a set of kind of like terminologies and approaches from societies that are, don't have states. And so they kind of use them to understand the Middle Ages. And that's great because we then no longer fall into the trap of assuming that the Middle Ages was just like a state today. But there's a problem. Social anthropology, which I love, kind of fundamentally assumes, operates from the kind of core assumption that the societies that they study are kind of frozen in time. Like you can't, social anthropology and time doesn't work very well together because all the methods that you've developed is to assume a kind of stasis, that everything kind of like is in balance and functionally creates a kind of whole.
So the idea here is that, anthropologists turn up on a Melanesian island in 1972, write a report about how this functions, and then that's just frozen in time, basically.
And it's been like that since forever.
Right.
And it is, and if you turn up like 50 years later, the assumption, unless, I don't know, capitalism or modernity has arrived and wrecked it, if you could just leave it there, it'd be the same.
It'd just be like this,
right? That's the assumption. Yeah. That, has its own problems. For a medievalist, it's obviously dissatisfying because our societies change. But for me, it's also dissatisfying in a second way, which is that it leaves very little room for the political agency of medieval actors, like the people you talked about there in our opening. Like the anthropologists would look at them and they'd say, it's a kind of like carnivalesque.
I thought the word carnivalesque.
Carnivalesque, right? Like because the kind of assumption there with carnival, right? Just for our listeners, is and you do see anthropologists who work on kind of the past saying this, like, look at carnival. It's letting out of steam so that the society can continue to kind of function. Yeah, sometimes it can be, but the people we're looking at in the Middle Ages, they were real people who had real desires to change and shape their societies. And so what I like about the kind of anarchist or anarchist-affiliated kind of like thought instead is that it assumes agency. It assumes different kind of ideas of how a society should operate. And kind of build in that the people you're looking at might be trying to build that, might be trying to create it, might be trying to shape them. Obviously they're not trying to create anarchism as imagined in the 19th century. They've got their own ideas, but those ideas are very different to modern-day state-like ideas.
That's a good reply, I think, to the question of, is it okay to talk about this? I agree. I mean, I'm picking up here on the themes you're talking about of trying to get inside the worldview of the people at the bottom, essentially, right? Because you mentioned, this political philosophy we have in the Middle Ages. We could read John of Salisbury, we could read Giles of Rome or whatever it is. These thinkers, and they tell us something about how it was at the other end of society, how society is supposed to be, right? But there's a chance with these anarchist-affiliated thinkers, or whatever we want to call them, that we might be able to understand. I'm not going to say these freaks who go around calling themselves the Queen of Fairy and worshipping dogs and doing all this kind. But these people who otherwise seem a bit puzzling. They certainly seem puzzling if your starting point is John of Salisbury and Giles of Rome and these scholastic and post-scholastic political thinkers. David Graeber, he's a concrete example of one of these. I mean, he wasn't mealy-mouthed about it like I am, talking about anarchist affiliate and things like that. He did actually go out and call himself an anarchist.
Occupy Wall Street and everything.
Exactly.
Like,
and he is one of the suspects for a practicing anarchist. He is one of the people to whom it has been attributed, right? The phrase, we are the 99%, I think he's one of the people who... So, he was actually out there in the streets, not like me, sitting behind my keyboard, trying to get published in obscure journals no one reads and often not succeeding. But so if we talk about David Graeber, this is someone whose writing has had an influence, actually both on you, and I've actually also cited David Graeber quite a bit. He's had an influence on both of us. Can we say something about how his writing might impact medieval studies?
Absolutely. So I'm going to focus in on his last book, a book that was published posthumously with David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. It's, we should warn our listeners, it's a frustrating book, but I think it's also the most important book to have been published in the political sciences or humanities in my lifetime. Which is not a long time, admittedly, but nevertheless, it is. So, just to kind of like set the scene a little bit of it is what Graeber and Wengrow does in Dawn of Everything is that they say, right, we've actually now accumulated such a body of evidence through good old-fashioned archaeology of what the earlier tens of thousands years of human history was like, that we need to radically overturn the kind of received vision of how human societies evolved. So we've got this kind of standard narrative that the Stone Ages were lovely, innocent, childlike, small-scale groups of 20 to 30 people living relatively equal lives, but very simple, and so on. And my youngest has just finished being taught about the Stone Age in primary school, and that's precisely what he's kind of like come home. He found it fascinating, and kind of delivered this. And so you get that kind of like Stone Age, and then you kind of, unfortunately, humanity makes the kind of Faustian bargain with agriculture, and we start farming, and that creates the conditions for oppressive monarchs. And then, within half a page in your kind of like textbook in human history, you've got kind of god kings and states, and we are on track for modernity.
Before you know it, you're paying council tax and you're addicted to Facebook.
Absolutely. It just follows. Once you kind of like start planting that grain, that's what goes right. So it's biblical, right? As Wengrow and Graeber points out, it's the apple in the Garden of Eden. Obviously, like, that's not even us being kind of fanciful. That's literally what the Bible says. You're right. Like, we used to live in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. Then we fell. Now Adam has to do agriculture.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just the same script.
One of the curses. Absolutely.
One of the curses. Right. Yeah. It's literally the story that the Bible tells. And what Graeber and Wengrow then shows is, I would say, there's two kind of like really important kind of things. One is that actually these pre-state, pre-agriculture or semi-agricultural societies were much more complex, much more capable than what we used to think they were like. They weren't innocent little groups of hunter-gatherers who might have been lovely but couldn't amount to anything. They built vast complexes like the Göbekli Tepe, a temple down in Turkey, this vast, intricate stone temple carved by hunter-gatherers. They seem sometimes to have organized into hierarchical kind of polities, or at the other end, kind of very, very freeform entities. But the point is that the kind of political systems and the achievements that they could have while being non-state, while being hunter-gatherers, was vast. The other side of the argument is in showing that road towards statehood is not a kind of a single direction of traffic. So that's where their work on the Americas become really important. Medievalists might be most interested in what they do with the evidence from Cahokia, this empire that grew up around the Mississippi in the medieval warm period, so like 11th to 13th centuries. It's a perfect fit for our central medieval kind of kingdoms. They get maize imported. The hot weather enables kind of growth of agriculture. And much like in medieval Europe, there follows more complex societies, more hierarchy. We don't have any writing, so we're just building all this from the kind of grave goods and monuments. But it's pretty conclusive stuff. And it looks like, okay, yeah, we're going to get something that looks a lot like a late medieval state. And then kind of circa 1200, it stops. Like, people leave.
People just kind of go home.
They go home. Right. They abandon the mounds. What happened there? Well, later legends.
So we're oral tradition. Okay.
I mean, like, and I'm not saying that could easily be something people have intended to explain why there's these mounds here, but it's interesting nonetheless. They talk about kind of like, okay, you had this priest class who abused its power, and people, killed them and then kind of stopped paying taxes and stuff like that. So the point is kind of like that. What I think Graeber and Wengrow does very successfully here they also want to just turn you into anarchists. I don't think they're that good at that, but I think they're very good at making you think, okay, you know what? Actually, there can be kind of political and societal ideas outside that are non-states in these kind of like past societies.
So you can organize yourself into larger units without ending up on a kind of conveyor belt that inevitably takes you towards council tax and Facebook and all these awful things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you can get off in fact, and they're trying to say that people have historically gotten off the conveyor belt.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And that's really kind of, to me, it was an explosion in my mind. To suddenly make me go like, okay, you know what? Unconsciously, I had accepted this story that, regrettable as it was, with all its kind of like violence and so on, states were just inevitable. It was the way it was going to go. And just suddenly had to think like, okay, kind of like actually have to take seriously these different kinds of organization in the past. I think that's enormously illuminating.
I'm very much minded to agree. The question that is smashing on the door of my mind is that, of course, isn't the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages, a example of a society that was on the conveyor belt? This is a profoundly agricultural society, and and if you accepting kind of the Italian peninsula and places like this in the southern Mediterranean, generally speaking, upwards of 90% of the population is engaged in agriculture, and they were subjected to states that look very weak compared to our states, but nonetheless, they were subjected to state power. People didn't escape from that. Yes, these examples from the Americas might show us that the path to statehood was not inevitable, but the medieval examples might say that it was inevitable. Or
that's a fair point. Not. It's a very, very fair point, Richard. We are not going to kind of like, people aren't going to go home Cahokia style. But I kind of seized upon one word that you said there, and that was the word accepting. Right. So I think what we often end up doing when we look at the development in medieval Europe is that we say, accepting the situation in the Italian peninsula, in the Low Countries, in Frisia, with all their city-states, accepting the situation in Dithmarsken and Frisia with its kind of like free peasant communities, and obviously looking beyond, the pagan Lithuania,
Iceland, of course. Iceland
of course, just like Iceland.
Greenland doesn't count.
Setting aside Iceland, Ireland doesn't fit that well either.
What we mean is not France.
Exactly, right? Like the Middle Ages, accepting kind of like Germany fundamentally, right? Because I mean, like, okay, Germany, that's a different story, and I'd like to go back to kind of how we can bring in nobility into this story, because I'm not an anarchist as such, but even if I was, I would be a really bad one who likes kind of like nobles as much as I like peasants. But we can get back to the kind of anarchist potential of the nobility. Okay, so the point is that there's actually a multitude of different kinds of polities. They all contain state-like elements. Sure, this isn't the Americas, but what I think kind of Graeber and Wengrow help us do is to kind of like stop accepting them, right? Start saying, you got France and England who are on this kind of like, highway towards the intensive monarchical kind of government. But actually, there's a whole host of other kinds of polities who share some elements with them, but where there's also other elements that we have discounted too fast, that we have kind of haven't paid the kind of sufficient attention to.
That gives us an opportunity to talk about something very concrete, I think, in particular. We're recording in Scandinavia today, we're recording in Denmark, and here during the Middle Ages there was a particular social and political institution which has attracted no little attention through the years, at least in this part of the world. It was in Old Norse called a thing, and later on in Middle Danish, probably something like a ting, and today we just call it ting. The thing, the assembly, for maybe want of a better translation. Can you tell us something about these assemblies in Scandinavia? I'm clearly motioning towards the idea they might tell us something that that Graeber and Wengrow would agree with.
Absolutely. So the kind of great early 20th century Danish historian Arup talked a lot about the assemblies and portrayed this kind of quite romantic, kind of like blissful image of an early Middle Ages that was pretty much democratic, right? In which kind of societies, Danish society was governed by the free peasants, so bønder in Danish, who negotiated with the king at the assembly, but who fundamentally kind of like ran society in a proto or semi-democratic way.
And the idea with these assemblies is you've got them operating on a very local level. I mean, if you cycle through the Danish countryside on a summer day today, you'll often see that there's Tingvej, and almost always it's up a hill as well, which always intrigues me here in Jutland. So on a village level, there are assemblies meeting from the Viking Age and possibly even before the Viking Age, if we believe Tacitus, which we don't have to.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, exactly. we won't just pretend Tacitus doesn't exist. But you've got these. Essentially, it's a space for mediating disputes when it's at a local level, right?
Yeah, that's one of its functions.
So and so's pig broke into my house and ate my dinner or whatever it is. What are we going to do about it? I kind of want to go and hit him with an axe. Well, we're going to go and talk about it before you hit him with an axe, right? And then they're going all the way up to regional assemblies where greater political issues can be dealt with, even up to potentially offering some form of resistance to royal power.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would go much further than that, Richard. So they go up to the big assemblies of the three kind of constituent nations of medieval Denmark: Jutland, Zealand, and Scania. Each of them have their own regional assembly in Viborg, in Ringsted, and in Lund. These are the sites where the kind of peasants, the free peasants, and the elite of these regions debate matters up to and including the election of kings. Because Denmark remains an elective monarchy throughout the Middle Ages. And certainly when we're looking at the situation up to the mid-12th century, that's quite a real power, right? There's half a dozen at any time or so members of the royal kindred, various kind of cousins, who all have an equal right to be elected as king. And when we kind of drill down into the sources, they show quite kind of vivid, quite kind of forceful debate at the assemblies. Certainly, there was also magnate influence and magnate power. There's no disputing that. But you look at a man like Saxo Grammaticus, who doesn't really like the assemblies. He's quite kind of critical of them.
This is a Danish warrior and priest.
I think he's more warrior of the imagination.
Okay, really? Okay.
I think he'd have liked to be. His parents were. His dad was.
He's a Danish priest who occasionally plays dress up, and he leaves us with this, I mean, absolutely massive history of the Danes and the deeds of the Danes from the early 1200s.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he kind of quite likes a powerful king. But even he talks a lot about the assemblies. He makes them really fundamental to his story. And he's quite insistent that these assemblies were unpredictable. It's what he keeps coming back to, that the kind of like choice of the population was unpredictable. Now, one of the reasons that I'd like to tie the assembly back to Graeber is that the kind of Arup-like story is that this was a beautiful, wonderful way, but alas, it had to go before the kind of like power of the king. So we get the big civil war that happens just around the time, just before Saxo is writing in Scania, where you see the kind of royal power and magnates allied against the kind of local community, lower aristocracy of Scania in alliance with the peasants of Scania, organizing themselves around the assembly sites. And so the story goes, that's the last Kampbetragtninger, the last kind of like rigor mortis of the old Scandinavian society defending itself against the future. And inevitably, they get, walked over by the kind of like, iron boot of modernity. But should we accept that inevitability? I'd suggest not, with kind of like Graeber sitting on my shoulder and trying to kind of like drill into all the evidence that's there in the chronicles for the power of these assemblies. Mm-hmm. I'd then point to things like accepting, Italy, where we get a modernity that's organized very differently around these kind of like urban communities. I'd look at situations in the kind of like northern German area, Saxony, Frisia, Dithmarsken, where you get or all the way up to Iceland, where you get these kind of self-organizing peasant communities that become really quite kind of like complex.
Mm. Yeah, because they're still, I think it's an important point here, when we talk about these self-organizing peasant communities, that could be Iceland or that could be Dithmarschen. One might wonder, is everybody equal there? Are all the peasants just getting on, farming their crops, giving each other high fives, sharing some mead in the evenings, and it all really cozy? No, they become highly stratified internally, in fact, right? And they feud, and there are some peasants who've got a lot of resources and who employ all the other peasants and actually treat them quite badly. But it is still true to say that there's not really a centralized executive. There's people treating each other badly, and there's differentiation in terms of class, often quite dramatically so. But there's no one authority that acts like a police or an army, right, who says, right, now we're all going to go to war with these people, or now you've all got to pay this tax.
Yeah, try telling my paternal grandmother that she was a subaltern. She was from a farm with 3 chimneys. She would very much like you to know. Whereas, alas, her husband was from a farm with only 1 chimney. This was like an issue to the point where when my granddad tried to get his mom to show him his dad's farm, she claimed to have forgotten where it was, but she would like to show him her farm with the 3 chimneys. So she just obliterated her husband's family memory in order to preserve the, within the peasant community, elite status of being a kind of like 3 chimney kind of people. But you're quite right, right? It's a different kind of politics. And I've been trying to think, just, speculatively here, right? How far could this go, right? Do we have to accept a kind of like, but eventually? In order to try and think with that, I've been trying to cast my eyes a little bit further away to the east. I've been trying to look at some of the recent work that's been done on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Okay.
Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is kind of like, your early modern kind of like construction of Poland and Lithuania. And as my good co-researcher Wojciech Gisiarski, who's from Poland, kind of tries to remind me when I over-romanticize this, was a terrible place in many ways. Like the Polish peasantry was treated abominably. That accepted, it was also a place that kind of like well into the 18th century operated with these kind of like relatively local, self-organizing, this powerful aristocracy in opposition to the central, to any centralizing kind of like power. And what I find really fascinating is some recent work like by Richard Butterwick and others on it, which is saying, if we actually look at what happens there in the 18th century, they're kind of finding their own path to something that looks like a kind of French Revolution, kind of like a transformation of their society. And I just think that's utterly fascinating. I think it reminds us that like the path that the Middle Ages ended up going down, and that then eventually got us to, counterattacks on Facebook and so on. Maybe you didn't have to take that road, right? Like maybe there were some other roads with their own problems, obviously.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been a utopian situation.
Certainly not a utopian
still been exploitation internally. Yeah.
Absolutely. We could have gotten, there were many paths to now, or, as I think Graeber would want us to say, to a different now and to a different future.
Lars, you mentioned elites, and I do actually think of you as a historian of elites, as much as we've had some great conversations here about peasants. Is it true to say that medieval peasants are closer to our modern mentality than medieval elites? Is it the other way around? Is one of the reasons that we do tend to focus on medieval elites because their state-based way of thinking is closer to ours?
That's a good question. And I think it's important to remember that there is, to use Scott, whom you mentioned at the beginning, this kind of like terminology, about hidden and public transcripts.
Scott's theory is that whenever you've got some sort of protest activity, and whenever people allegedly come out with their political demands, people who are in a kind of position of having power over them may not be totally honest, right? They'll come out with the thing they think is safe to say. That's what he calls the public transcript. And then they'll have actually their sort of real, most inner desires. And that will be the hidden transcript. I mean, a classic example, we talked about the Queen of Faery in Kent in 1450. Sometimes the public transcript can seem, frankly, totally insane.
Yep.
But that's because it's in the peasants' interest to seem like they're a bit crazy. It makes them harder to predict. And the thing they don't feel comfortable saying is, I think we should just kill all the lords, for example, right? So that's your public and your hidden transcripts. It's the thing you claim you want, the thing you actually want.
So for an example from kind of like medieval Denmark, you look at how during the kind of like autocratic reign of Valdemar I, when he's kind of killed off all the kind of like local kind of magnate kind of elite from the royal family, he's suddenly finding the peasants who used to have their kind of local connections really difficult to govern. So he brings them on a kind of campaign to Norway, and the peasants start complaining about the food. They start saying like, there's not food enough. And it's kind of like baffling. It makes them seem really kind of like comical and stupid. But what's I think is kind of like happening is that they're saying, you know what, I'm no longer feeling motivated to participating in your project because I don't feel like there's anything in it for me, and I don't think like you're respecting my rights. But they don't say that because that's a whole, other kettle of fish. And instead they say, well, there's not enough food, so we need to go home. That's hard to argue with because they are running out of food.
Right.
So I think it's important to kind of remember that we also have those public and hidden kind of transcripts, right? Like
today,
right? Like there's places in Denmark where people are more kind of like loving of the state than others. And we need to remember that. That said, modern-day public transcript, I think, is very much the child of those king-focused intellectuals you talked about in the beginning, right? John of Salisbury is easy to understand because he's kind of like us, because we're kind of his descendants. I think to kind of fully grasp what the kind of variegated elite of the Middle Ages, from kind of like middling aristocrat on down to your bonde, your like free peasant in Scandinavia, their understanding of what they'd like the world to be like, their kind of insistence on private rights, on local traditions, and the inviolability of those is really powerfully alien to us. And it's easy to imagine them as quite like us when we kind of like read into them what they, we think what they're really saying is this. But I think they're very, very alien. And that makes them all the more fascinating.
Lars, that's a fascinating note on which to end, I think. An encouragement for us to pay more attention to the peasantry. And I hope, and I certainly feel convinced that David Graeber and Wengrow's book, much as it has its problems, might help us get there. Thank you so much for coming on, Lars.
Thank you so much, Richard.
The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.